book club meeting, the first historically accurate anti-racist book club for Charleston meeting. I'm so excited. Uh, Guys, I'm overwhelmed, so that's a little bit of that's driving my emotions right now. But I'm going to get into this and get into this conversation. Thank you so much for everyone who is watching. Thank you for everyone who is still purchasing Eventbrite tickets and joining us. Hopefully, things go off without a hitch. And I just want to jump right in there in the interest of time. So first and foremost, before we begin, I want to first say thank you to Tony, and we have a second ASL coordinator, Courtney, who is currently off screen. I wanted to say thank you to them both for providing this very necessary service so that everyone can have access to, as many people can have access to this space, this community of folks who are really just anxious to learn and talk about this great book. I wanted to acknowledge them. But I also wanted to start, before I start any discussions in Charleston or anywhere, I want to start with a land and labor acknowledgement. So for those who are watching, for those who are viewing on Facebook and on YouTube, I want you to take a moment. You can either sit quietly, you can close your eyes, but I want you to first, if you know of the tribes, if you know of the indigenous folk who first inhabited the land you currently are on, I want you to think about them, even if you don't know them by name. But if you do know them by name, go ahead and drop their names, the name of that indigenous tribe or community, into the comment section. I want to acknowledge those whose land we're on. I want to acknowledge those who were victims of genocide, those who were erased from our historical record by one way or another. I'm just going to say a couple of names, names of indigenous tribes and communities: the Ashapu, the Kiowa, the Edisto, the Catawba. And I'll just offer you just to sit there. The Stono tribe, thank you. Thank you. And I also want to acknowledge the ancestors. Thank you, Kusoland. Thank you all. I'm so happy to see the comments. I also want to acknowledge the ancestors who are all in this book, who are in this space right now. I feel them with me. I want you to invite our ancestors into this space. If there's a name from the book that you'd like to say, you could type that in to the comments right now. I'm going to say Archibald Grimke. I'm going to say Denmark Vasey. I'm going to say Gullah Jack. I'm going to say Frederick Douglass. I'm doing the famous ones. There's some lesser known ones in there. I want to save them for y'all. But I also want to call in my ancestors. I want to call in my ancestor, my great-grandfather, who lived on Wadmalaw Island and whose historical record I encountered that listed him as African, which was different from the way the rest of the family was listed, and that is Enoch Gadsden from Wadmalaw Island, who played a person who I do not know where they are buried on Wadmalaw. So I just wanted to start with that. Thank you for just joining with that. Make sure we call the ancestors in to inform this discussion. Make sure we keep them at the forefront. Angelina Grimke, keep them at the forefront of this discussion as we talk. This is what we do it for. Thank you, Heather, Robert Smalls. Yes, so thank you all for that piece. I'm going to move on through the agenda. And the next bit of business is I want to introduce my moderators, my co-moderators, people who reached out to me with extraordinary enthusiasm for reading, for community. We have here Jeanell. You can wave Jeanell. And also have Khalid here. Khalid is also a Charleston native. And yeah, I'm going to actually read Khalid's quickly, just read a couple of sentences just to let you know who he is. Khalid, like I said, is a Charleston native. He's currently studying global health in college. Also he hopes to add African American studies as a major. His love of reading came from historical fiction like The Secret Life of Bees, which is his favorite book. And he loves work by Black poets. So thank you so much, Khalid, for that. And I want to pull up a little bit about Jeanell, who's a rock star. Y'all probably already know a lot about Jeanell because she's just amazing. Jeanell, let me see, Jeanell, I think you texted me your bio real quick. Okay. I'm trying to make sure I have it. Jeanell, I'm about to make you, can you go off mic and say a little bit about yourself? So I don't hold
Sure, yes. I'm Jeanell. I'm an educator, elementary school educator, mom of 4. I love reading. I thrive off of community, chips and queso, and I can almost always be found either in the library or a bookstore. So thank you for having me, Mika.
You know what? Chips and queso was exactly what I was trying to search for. I'm like, you said chips and queso. So I was trying to find that real quick. Let me hop back into the agenda. Thank you so much to my moderators. They're going to help with the conversation. Again, we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. So we're doing that with featuring your faces, bringing in your comments and questions. So both Leslie, and shout out to Leslie, who was off camera. Shout out to Leslie Mack. Leslie Mack is also going to be helping with the curation of questions and bringing them into the discussion. But let me get into why we're all here. We have 2 esteemed guests right here, and I'm excited. I'm geeking out a little bit. I'm trying to suppress it. I'm trying to do better than I did last time, Ethan and Blaine. I was really excited. I cringe whenever I listen back to Vasey's my interview from a few years ago, but I don't cringe at your part. And I just wanted to take this moment to actually let you both, let me make sure I'm not messing up. Yeah, let you both introduce yourselves. I actually want to take this moment to introduce who you are, introduce why you're here today, joining us. And what makes this book right now, what makes this book, I guess, important right now in a specific time. So I'm just gonna let you both kind of explain who you are and introduce yourselves.
Sure. Okay. You want to start?
Go ahead.
Excuse me. I'm Ethan Kytie. I am a professor of history in California. We're both professors of history in California. So we are 3 hours away from you all and about 15 to 20 degrees hotter. I know it's hard to imagine hotter than Charleston in the summer, but it's about 110 right now. So if our screen happens to go blank, it's because they're doing rolling power blackouts here in California because it's so crazy hot. But crossed. It's not as bad today as it was yesterday. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, I'm a professor of history at Fresno State in Central California, and the co-author with Blain Roberts, my better half and colleague, of Denmark Vesey's Garden, Slavery and Memory in the Cradle of Confederacy, which Mika so generously chose to debut this fantastic book club. And she's being very modest talking about when she interviewed us 2 years ago while we were on our book tour. This book first came out in 2018. And I, to be honest, I don't know if Blaine would share this sentiment, but we went to 7, 8 states, did 25, 30 events. And that was one of my favorite, if not my very favorite. We did it at Harold's Cabin, and there was this packed upstairs room in Harold's Cabin, and everyone had a cocktail, and some people were eating food, and we live streamed it on Facebook, and it was really fun. So I imagine this is going to be just as much fun.
Yeah, and another key player in that event was Itinerant Literate. So I want to give a shout out to them. Great local bookstore. We're big fans of theirs, and also Blue Bicycle Books downtown. They've also been very supportive of us. So yes, I am Blain Roberts, also teach here in Fresno. Ethan and I met in graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and of course lived in Charleston from 2005 to 2007. And that's how we became interested in the memory of slavery in the city, and ended up researching and writing this book. And Mika, I think that you're right that this book does really speak to this moment, and we're humbled and grateful that people think so. What's kind of interesting about the book and the way a project like this evolves is that we didn't realize what we were writing when we set out to write it. And it kind of started as a personal exploration of some of our experiences in the city, really regarding tourism and our experiences in the city and with seeing tours going around town and noticing how they were both good and bad. So that's kind of where the project came from. So if you've read the book, we actually started kind of at the end. The final chapter of the book deals with historical tourism. And that's where our interest and our research started. And then we kind of went back to the beginning, which would be the end of the Civil War, to trace this history of the memory of slavery.
Yeah, I think we sort of found a story we didn't know was there. The connections to the present weren't apparent to us. It was very personal. It felt like a story of, we thought initially we were just writing for scholars like ourselves. And very quickly though, became clear that this was a larger story. Even though it's about the city alone, it's a larger story that we could connect to the events that are going on. We could go on, but I don't want to go on too long on just this opening question.
Sure, so we could say more about tourism and how we came to it, or you can direct us in a different way.
Hi, my name is Mika and I'm always muted. That's my new life now. No, I thank you so much for that. I think that was very important. I think that helps people who may not have been familiar with your work prior to reading, or, you know, I know some folks are still finishing. Maybe that helped them. And I do look back fondly on that day at Harold's Cabin. Harold's Cabin is a friend of mine, and a great place. I think there was a second part of like the initial question that I wanted to raise. I'm looking at my notes now. I'll ask it specifically to kickstart the questions. Well, I see that Leslie put, how do you see your book factoring into a specific moment in history? Are there any lessons to draw from? Thank you so much. I got a producer in the house. Thank you. All right.
Well, I think probably the best way to put it is, like we said, we didn't think it would factor into anything other than a scholarly debate initially. But frankly, the world has changed over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think a lot of people starting in 2015, starting with the tragedy at Emmanuel in 2015, started to realize that the way we think about our past, the way we think about the institution of slavery, and particularly the way we think about these things in a place like Charleston and in Charleston, speaks to the country as a whole. And it's not just an academic debate, or not just something that should be interesting to people who work in museums or people who do historical tours. But it really frames how we understand our country, how we understand the citizens in our country, the place of those citizens. While I'm not interested in giving any, speaking at all about the evil person who committed those murders in 2015, that tragedy, I think, opened the eyes of a lot of people to a larger conversation that some people have been having in Charleston, particularly the African-American community, former enslaved people and their descendants have been having for generations, that a lot of the country, particularly a lot of white citizens in this country, had been ignoring. And it forced people to reconcile with that, to think about the place of Confederate symbols, Confederate monuments. It's no wonder that while the violent actions of police officers in Minnesota and other places this summer and spring and summer didn't directly relate to Confederate monuments, Confederate symbols, 4 or 5 years after that horrible moment, everyone in the country knew they did relate to that. And there's it's not surprising that there are protests immediately across the country at these sites after the murder of George Floyd and others. And I think that that's part of a larger a changing context, a changing national context that's taken place. And so I wouldn't in any way say that our book does anything other than sort of connect that to this long conversation that's been going on in Charleston about the place of slavery in our memory.
Yeah, and to add to that, it is important to emphasize, as Ethan did, that Black Charlestonians have been having this conversation about the lies at the center of much of our Southern history and American history for a long, long time. And so what we ended up hoping to do, and what I hope that we did, was to really capture the voices of Black Charlestonians and how they were calling out these lies from the very beginning. And so another way in which I hope that our book can add to this conversation is, sometimes today you have defenders of, let's say, Confederate monuments. You have defenders of the lost cause mythology, accusing people of, say, being politically correct. They'll say, you're judging people in the past by the standards of the present. And that is not at all true. And one of the things that you find when you dive into the historical record is that Black Charlestonians and some white allies have been protesting the lost cause and these monuments and these memorials from the very beginning. And knowing that long history, I think, is important. And hopefully it can help inform the conversation that's going on today.
Thank you so much. And I love the fact that you because when if I go to McLeod or other historical sites, oftentimes I'll hear people who are newer to the history ask the question, well, was it really that bad? And almost ask, was it intentional? Pretty much, like, was the mistreatment of Black bodies, was that intentional? And when I hear that question, it kind of reminds me of what you just offered up in comment in terms of this was all intentional. And from the beginning was a concerted effort, and it served a very specific purpose. And so I think a lot of people really are looking for those trap doors, and really, honestly, it's the monster that we see right there. We have to believe ourselves. I wanted to just shout out Katie Dudley. I know you all, we'll save it for later, but I know your next project and Katie Dudley scholarship go hand in hand. Katie wrote a dissertation based on tourism in New Orleans, and of course, I'm reading that. I'm reading that as well, and I refer to it often. So thank you, Katie, so much. You're a friend as well, and I appreciate your comment. I wanted to just ask one question really quickly, if we can, and then we're going to open it up to any comments. If those who are viewing on YouTube and Facebook, please make sure you are submitting your comment or question. Submit that in the comment section. Thank you, Leslie, for adding the prompt to the screen. This is interactive, y'all, so even though we can't see your face, this time, we expect and encourage you to participate. But before we switch into the public Q&A, I wanted to ask you, the most recent news that I've been so aching to ask you is, how have you felt? How have you internalized? How have you revisited the whole Calhoun Monument now that the Calhoun Monument, right, at least the top of it is still, the base is still there, the pillar is still there. But yeah, tell me how you reflected on that moment when you saw the statue come down.
Well, it might be important to make a confession.
Which is what?
Which is that, I think there was a part of us that just thought it's never going to come down.
Yeah, I was amazed. Yeah.
Because as many of you know, Black Charlestonians have been protesting this and defacing it and mocking it too for so long. And then, of course, over the last several years, there's been so much momentum, and yet nothing had happened. And so it was a real thrill to read the announcement that there was going to be an important announcement the next day about the fate of the Calhoun Monument, and to see it come down. Of course, we were watching. We actually listened and to the mayor's speech in the car. We were driving somewhere, but we got out our phones so that we could hear it. It was very thrilling. I think it might have been a little bit more thrilling to see, Bree Newsome scale the pedestal and give Calhoun a shove.
Right,
nevertheless.
Right. I was struck, so in 2015, a couple months before the Emanuel tragedy, we were at a public event talking about the history of the Calhoun Monument. It was in Charleston for the end of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. It was an event. It was at the Dock Street Theater, big crowd. We were there with a bunch of other scholars, David Blight and several other scholars of historical memory. And we were in the Q&A, and someone asked us towards the end a question that was basically, we've been talking about the Kowloon Monument, just other Confederate and monuments like that. And someone asked something to the effect of, when are we going to ever do anything about these monuments? Are these monuments ever going to come down? And the panel that was up there just all kind of collectively sort of took a breath, and then David Blight sort of sighed. And the sigh was kind of like this expression of, we've been writing about these things for a long time, and the Black community in Charleston's been protesting these things for a much longer time, and nothing's happened. And it was sort of this resignation almost that if you had asked me at that moment, I would have said, yeah, it's just not going to happen. Confederate monuments weren't removed, and then it starts to change. But even then, even a month ago, even 3 months ago, I would have said the Calhoun Monument's not coming down. Charleston ain't. They can't even come up with agree on a plaque.
Blaine, I didn't want to cut you off.
It kind of speaks to the fact that sometimes we as historians lack imagination. We write about activism in the past. We're even activists ourselves, but it can be difficult to sometimes imagine a new future. And so I think we owe a lot to the activists on the ground in Charleston for pushing so hard to make the city do what it needed to do.
I think I'm off mute. Oh, yes. Okay, cool. Oh, we got a good switch. Yeah, thank you so much, Tony, Courtney. I think what I wanted to offer up too was, and I'm not going to say anything definitively, but the Heritage Act, which protects Confederate monuments, that has been used so long to protect the Calhoun Monument, and we knew it wasn't a Confederate monument. However, I think even the mystery around, because all of my life I was told that statue belonged to an entity outside of the city, and the city's hands were tied. However, it came down, the city said, "Oh, we've owned it the whole time." So again, being honest and being forthright with Black people, with the city at large about these monuments and who erected it, and a white political will is something I always refer to, and I think we saw that really inform the decision around the Calhoun Monument.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for adding the prompt, Leslie. As you just saw, we want folks of color to offer a comment. I see there's one from Brianna Collier. Those of us that have read the book and are part of these types of groups are invested in learning true history and bringing about change. How do we get these types of texts to the forefront and force those who may be reluctant to learn? Good question, Brianna.
Wow.
You.
Great question.
I wish I knew the answer.
I did too.
Well, let me just say before, I don't know. I mean, it's simple answers could be like, improve our educational system, put more money into education, and put the right people in charge. But those are big mountains to climb. I mean, I do trying to maybe think more, have a greater imagination. I guess one positive thing we can take away from the last 5 or 6 years is that people today, I think, have connect people across the country. And when I say people, I think I mean more white people than people of color, because people of color have known this for a long, long time. But white people across the country, I think, realize in a way they didn't in 2015, they realize that the Confederate flag is inextricably tied to white supremacism. Mm-hmm. The Confederate monuments are inextricably tied to that. A good proportion of the white members of this country realize that in a way that they didn't in 2015. Ridiculous that they didn't, but yeah. And so I mean, in that way, I mean, the protests, and that's the result of work on the street. Yeah. That's the result of people from, Bree Newsom scaling the Confederate flag in Columbia, to the campaign to bring down the Confederate monuments in New Orleans a couple of years later, to all of the protests revolving around the aftermath of the Floyd murders and other murders this summer. That work worked, to sort of eloquently put it. And so that leads me to think that there are ways to change people's minds, but it's so hard, and we can't expect people to do that all the time. So how? I mean, that question was a great one. How do you do it through an educational system? How do you bring works of history, works of literature that do speak to the truth about the past out to people? That's a tough question.
Yeah, it is. I think that the point about activism is really important. A lot of the ideas and concepts that are now really kind of mainstream, intersectionality, for example, right? These have been floating around in academic communities and activist communities for a really long time. But when activists hit the streets, they're the ones who are really responsible for, I think, sharing this knowledge and this history with a wider public. And public spaces like Twitter, for all of its faults, I think can be very useful in terms of connecting academics and activists and creating these really kind of symbiotic relationships to support this kind of work. One kind of concrete thing that I would offer as an answer to this question, I do think that state standards are really important in terms of the K through 12 educational system. And because they guide what teachers are doing. And so one concrete thing that people might think about is trying to find ways to become involved in shaping those standards in their states, because I think that can matter and have a real impact in terms of what teachers teach in the classroom and what they feel they have permission to teach in the classroom.
And resources.
And the resources, that's right.
And I do think that fortunately there are above and beyond the standards world, there are organizations, academic institutions, others that are trying to provide sort of alternative curricula, how to teach the hard history of slavery, for instance. There was an entire website and companion book that came out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago.
SPLC.
By SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so those things provide alternatives, but it's a special teacher that has that can carve away the time, and maybe has an administration that allows them to carve away the time to do something that's outside the standards, that goes above and beyond the standards.
Thank you so much. We have a next question from Najima. What's up, Najima? From an academic, historic, and cultural perspective, please give your opinion on this consistently oppressive dismissal. Dismissal. I have my glasses on too. Dismissal of Native Black Charlestonian voice. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Najima.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that's, at least to view the question through our book and what we in our research, something that's been around and has happened since 1865. Our book really focuses on 1865 to the present, but local African Americans are often being overshadowed by a host of different groups, or being ignored by a host of different groups. One sort of bright spot that you can see in our history is that, and this is sort of probably the most surprising thing that we discovered while doing research for the book was, and we knew about the Reconstruction period and all that it entailed, but that it was this alternate moment for our historical memory and for Charleston's historical memory. It was a time where Native African American voices, Native Black Charleston voices were not as ignored as they would be later. I don't want to say that they were always put front and center, and then I don't want to say that they weren't derided in local newspapers. They were, but there was a place for freed people to collectively voice their opinion, to host emancipation celebrations in public, in the center squares, to take over the city in certain moments, and then certainly to have a political place in the city government and the state government in the late 1860s and the 1870s. That all goes away, and certainly the dominant theme in our book is the suppression of those voices.
Yeah, and which is really, it's not total. We can't say that because Black African-American memories of slavery really do thrive during segregation. It's just that they're thriving outside of public spaces, more kind of private spaces, families, churches, and schools. You know, that's a very important question. Why has this happened? And we could probably talk all day about it. I think on some level, there's an inability among some white Charlestonians, white Americans in general, to really just kind of recognize the dignity and inherent humanity of African Americans. There's just one thing that pops to mind that happened on a historical tour in Charleston back in 2008 or 9, I think. We talk about it in the book. We were on a carriage tour, and the tour guide was talking about early Charleston in the 1700s and made a comment that 85% of Charlestonians then were English, and the other 15% were French Huguenots.
Mm.
And
I just reread that part, and because the first time I read that, it jumped out at me. Like, how can you just gloss over?
Just
the majority,
ignoring the majority population of this place. It's breathtaking, really.
But it also requires a lot of energy to do that. Like, you have to erase an entire entire culture. Najima brought up the black Charlestonian voice, but even the indigenous, that's really like absent.
Frankly, it's also reflects this tour guide, and there are plenty of good tour guides in Charleston, right. But also a lot of those who are not well trained on a variety of fronts, and it reflected the absolute ignorance. Because if you go into historical sources, everybody, even the most racist white visitors, all they could talk about is how everybody on the street was African American, because it was an unusual experience for them being from other colonies or being from mainland England. So it was everywhere. It can't ignore unless you want to. It takes work, as you suggested.
Mm-hmm. It takes work. Okay, so we have the next question. We're going to bring Jeanell on as our moderator. She's going to come off mute. And I would love for Jeanell to pose her question. She had a great one. And whichever question you want, Jeanell.
Okay. Okay. Hi, Ethan and Blaine. In chapter 7, The Sounds of Slavery, you mentioned how the exclusion of Blacks from public spaces contributed to the lack of their power in challenging behaviors, such as the appropriation of the Gullah spirituals by white singers of the Society for the Preservation of Spirituals. My question is, as white authors, have you found yourselves in situations where the Black experience is represented without Black input? And what advice do you have for the non-BIPOC community in challenging such practices?
Oh, wow. Think about that.
And while you're thinking about that, I'll funnel the question to the comment area as well. If you are a part of the Black, Indigenous, people of color community, we still see this in many organizations and businesses today where our voices are left out. So my question to the attendees in that community is, what can we do to demand access? And should we just create our own seats at the table? And what can we do to get our voices heard?
Well, so I'm going to try to approach this through the lens of our book a little bit, and then we can maybe broaden out from that. I mean, one of so leaving aside our authorship and the fact that we're two white authors writing about this, which is, has its own, it raises its own issues. One of the challenges we felt in just doing this book is, and this actually came up early on when we were first putting together a proposal for the manuscript and sending it to an early press, and some of the feedback we got was you're not going to find enough on there's not enough African American voices out there. They haven't been talking about this. They haven't been writing about this, or maybe a little bit more honestly, we haven't recorded and written down and kept those memories. So you're not going to find a story. All you're going to find is a story of denial and forgetting by white citizens. That was the sort of feedback that we had gotten. And that's not what we found when we really started digging into the historical record. But you have to work, mostly because of Jim Crow prejudice, you have to work an awful lot harder to find those African American voices and experiences to take even the chapter on music and the sounds of slavery, which is set in the Jim Crow period in the 20s and 30s primarily. It was much harder. The Society for Preservation of Spirituals, and if you haven't read to this part of the book, please do. I think it's some of the most bizarre, interesting stuff we write about, these elite sons and daughters and grandsons and daughters of planters and who dress up like the plantation elite and then sing Gullah spirituals. I mean, this is crazy stuff.
Right. We're actually that's actually like this. We're seeing that being challenged. We're seeing folks reclaim their Gullah heritage back from like Geechee Boy.
Yeah.
Grits,
Right.
like
Sure.
you know, they were called out in the New York Times. But Black folks, like with the Calvin statue, Black folks have been yelling for years about how is this white family able to profit off of Gullah Geechee culture, and profit and you know, just rise to this level, and yet it's so it happens all the time. So
to be honest, one of the things in Aftermath, people asked us, what didn't we write? What did you regret you didn't do, and what did you regret you didn't? A chapter on food.
Yeah.
We were like, oh yeah, how did we possibly finish this book and then not have a chapter on food?
Yeah.
I think that you would have started another war with that. Like I ain't even gonna lie, food. history is one thing, but food. Woo.
Yeah.
Right.
But to sort of get back to your question and talking about how you recover these voices. I mean, one of the things that has been so important is the oral tradition in African-American families in the Low Country. And then people coming along and putting those down on paper so that they are available for scholars. The other thing that is kind of odd is that even though white Charlestonians often wanted to ignore and dismiss Black Charlestonians and what they were interested in and their memories, they couldn't help themselves sometimes. And so if you look at old issues of the News and Courier, that's what it used to be called, or the Charleston Evening Post, it's story after story after story of Black Charlestonians and their church meetings and their political meetings. And they are riddled with demeaning stereotypes and racism and everything that you might imagine. But if you know that going in and you know how to read those things for what they are, they can be really revealing sources, both in terms of basically the racism of white Charlestonians, but also in trying to uncover and recover some of what the Black community was doing in the city.
So I don't know if we really answered
I don't know
your
either,
question, Jeanell.
it's
a good one, and I wish I had a better
question.
answer.
It's a really good.
No, I think you did. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanell. And I wanted to just shout out a comment that just caught my eye from Margaret. Is it Selder? SEID. Yeah.
Margaret.
Margaret. She shouted out Alfonso Brown, another key. You know, you mentioned Alfonso. Thank you so much. You mentioned Alfonso and what the space that he occupied in the tourism industry, and you know, it was born out of, you know, a need or want, desire to see Gullah, Geechee, and African American stories told more accurately in Charleston. So thank you so much for that.
Just to riff on that for a little quick moment. I mean, that's one of the, you know, Blaine said at the very beginning that one of the things that got us interested in this was living in Charleston in the mid 2000s and exploring historical tourism. And we took some of the god-awful tours that existed at the time, and we also took a number of Alfonso Brown's tours, and the ways in which his tours were a photo negative of, you know, told an entirely different story, despite going to the same place, right? Going down to the Battery, and one tells the story of Fort Sumter and the decline of this romantic, glorious Cavaliers community, and then Alfonso Brown tells the story of looking across to Sullivan's Island and the pest house there, and enslaved people being brought in, and that was really, I think, laid the seed in some ways for our own beginning to say, wow, there's a segregated tourism industry here. How long has this gone on? And we started to pull at the thread. So yeah, I mean, Alfonso Brown he's been a pioneer and is still doing great work, you know, since the early 1980s.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And he does prominently in our last chapter.
He does. We ended up living, if you've read our book, you know that we talk about the search for a place to live in Charleston. We ended up living at the corner of Bull and Pitt Streets. And so what we could do, we were on the second floor, is we could look out and see the carriage tours. Many of them were the Old South Company. And those are the ones that are driven by the people in the kind of faux Confederate uniform costumes. So we could see them turning down Pitt Street to head down to the Battery. And we would see Alfonso and his Gullah Tours van going down Bull Street to pass the block where Denmark Vesey lived. And then, of course, to go by the Avery Research Center, which used to be the Avery Normal Institute. And so it was like this very symbolic thing that happened at the corner where we lived. And that was a kind of important moment for us in terms of understanding what was going on in terms of remembering slavery.
I think that's remarkable. Thank you for that. That's even remarkable to kind of even imagine you watching, you know, this one. And I always call him Captain Crunch. I'm trying not to be negative towards you, like the faux Confederate, but to see the one carriage go that way and then the other tourists go the other way, and that's how it feels. It feels like two Charlestons, and you mentioned that too toward the latter part of the book about even the plantations who were trying to address slavery's history. They would have segregated tours, so you could opt out, and I feel like that's what a lot of tourists are faced with, are these choices where it should be one uniform choice. I sent out some questions, a couple of hours, some prompts, some things to ponder to folks who were interactive. I actually didn't want to create book club questions. I wanted folks to kind of interact with this book a little bit differently, but this is just one question. I'm gonna pull one question for you both, and I think you already kind of touched on where we are in recent. I wanted to ask you. I often frame the historical erasure of Black and Gullah culture as violent, and one question I pose to folks is, what do you think? What is the most harmful side effect of erasing a whole culture from a cultural experience or tourism industry here?
Oh, wow.
I know. I'm sorry.
Most harmful. There's so many.
There's so many.
Because I honestly, the real quick, the club is we want to dismantle. We want to help folks begin to dismantle white supremacy. I think folks don't think of it as a violent act. They don't think of it as, oh no, this is actually going to have huge ramifications for folks. Not just, hidden history. It actually hurts people.
Yes. Well, I mean, to put it most simply, I think that the erasure of the African American experience as being at the center of the American experience, I think, as a historian, the historian in me doesn't like to have to linger on the present. I like to be able to talk about it, but it's really about the present and how we understand who makes up our country, what are the traditions in our country, what are the practices in our country, and how we make our country better, right? God, we can't even use better anymore because of people are in the White House right now. But if you don't have an accurate understanding of your past, you're not going to try to redress problems produced by that past. You're not even going to recognize them as problems, right? You're going to not understand that there is a centuries-long tradition of voter suppression, and that the efforts made towards voter suppression today and in the last 10 years are just a tweak in the Jim Crow era efforts to suppress African American votes. So if you don't know that past, you can, they honestly are really worried that there are people who are trying to pose as others and vote illegally, right? If you don't understand that. So that's just a kind of simple point, but I think it's with every element in our modern culture and our modern politics.
Yeah, and to kind of take your question and relate it back to the central theme of our book, the fact that there is a true memory of slavery and really a false memory of slavery. And we try to, track how those were used and changed over time to the extent that they did change. The false memory of slavery, this kind of romanticized, whitewashed memory, it says that, slavery wasn't all that bad. It wasn't that violent. It did not steal the livelihoods and the bodies of slaves. It wasn't responsible for the wealth of white Charlestonians and white Americans. You know, when you do that, that has an impact in the present, because then people are able to say, well, what about this reparations stuff? Mm-hmm. You know, we don't need to worry about that because slavery wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that central to our nation's history. It was not that central to the generation of white wealth. And so, or
it was a benevolent, kind thing, and you know, the worst example of that are those folks who start spouting off, well, you know, people were saved, you should be, you know, grateful and lucky, and that kind of nonsense. So so
you know, that's a type of erasure of Gullah culture, not quite what you were asking about, but it's important because understanding that memory is really falsified. Matters for the policies that we pursue today, and it matters for how Americans think about solutions to current racial and economic inequality.
It also
American, right? And you know, there's most of them. Too much of white America has a white vision of America. Right? Has a white vision of the South. You know, I talk to my students here in California about this all the time. When you say Southerner, they think white Southerner. Right, there are no Black Southerners in their imagination.
Well, that's the thing too. Even with not to bring too many issues into one conversation, but even with like the Colin Kaepernick kneeling, right? And we know that a veteran told him to kneel instead of sit, and then the whole thing was, well, that flag symbolizes my forefathers. I'm like, well, Black men and women served in the military. Like, it's like who has a monopoly? I guess I'm borrowing this from you both. Who has a monopoly over historical memory? And I think a lot of white folk think that they do. Before we get to Khalid's question, you know what? Let's get to Khalid's question right now. Go ahead. I wanted to bring him on. He made a comment, I believe, or a question. So go ahead, Khalid. I'm gonna let you get off mute. Do your thing.
Yeah. So, just reading this book, I was just like remembering all of like my memories of Black joy in Charleston, you know, through the streets. So like the Mozart Festival, which is very small now, and even just like our parades, so the Nancy Payton Day Parade, like Birch Homecoming Parade, those things are like so small now, like pushed back, like you can't really see them.
Right.
And I just looking at how you talk so much about like the Black churches and churches that don't even exist anymore. I was wondering, are Black churches the last sites of Black joy on the Charleston Peninsula?
That's a good question.
And like, sadly, so like I said, like all of these events are like not really in Charleston anymore, or they're like very small and they're only certain areas.
Right.
But it seems that like this is the only place where Black people can really go freely, you know, without being overly policed, you know, and just experience joy.
Yeah. Well, I would not want to speak to what is going on necessarily in Black churches in the peninsula today.
Or elsewhere.
Or elsewhere, since, you know, I haven't been. But I think that kind of implicit in your question is the fact that the peninsula has gentrified so much. And so that all of these celebrations that we document in the book, the Emancipation Days and, you know, the 4th of July, Tulaloo, all of these things were happening on the peninsula because the peninsula was really residentially integrated in a way that probably would surprise most white and Black Southerners in other cities, right, for much of the 20th century. It was kind of unique in that way. And what has happened over time, of course, is that many Black Charlestonians have been kind of pushed out. And so it does seem as though the opportunities and the spaces are not as great as they once were. I think that that's kind of one thing that I would say.
I mean, in some ways, while they're not exactly parallel, the that recent phenomena kind of mirrors what happens as Jim Crow is implemented in the city in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s, as these very public festivals like Tulaloo, like the Emancipation Day celebrations are happening in downtown Charleston during Reconstruction. That White Point Garden or Marion Square are places of African American joy, of celebrating the end of this institution, of celebrating feeling like you belong in this country. We wrote a piece a few years ago in the Atlantic talking about how the 4th of July was a black holiday in the late 19th century, and it was. And that's not to say that African Americans don't continue to celebrate it, but it was in the South. If you were celebrating the 4th of July, you were an African American or a white Republican aligning with them. You were not a conservative white Democrat.
That's right.
You didn't want to be part of that.
Right.
But they're driven out. Those celebrations are driven out. And they're not just political, they're political, but they're also dances and fish fries and parties and people picnicking and family events. Mamie Garvin Fields writes about this really movingly in Lemon Swamp, about how her family would go at the tail end of it after a lot of the most organized and pushed away. And so the gentrification has sort of, I don't know, it's kind of an echo of that as then Black churches themselves and Black African American people are pushed out of those spaces. So, I mean, I certainly want to speak to where the sites and spaces for that sort of expression are today, but that in some ways there's a lot of loss there, to my mind.
Well, I feel as if a renaissance is just has to happen. I think a renaissance has to, and I love the fact, that's why I wanted Khalid here, because him being someone younger than me and also born and raised here in Charleston, he has those memories that I don't. I have some of those memories from high school. When I went to St. Andrews, and shout out St. Andrews in the book as well. Oddly enough, the experiences in St. Andrews are what I dealt with in the late 90s about Black culture. But Khalid's experience, I remember those parades, especially the ones involving Birch High School and marching bands, were way bigger. And so, these places for Black joy have just slowly just dissolved, and we've seen Black churches just leave the peninsula one after the other. So thank you so much, Khalid. I think that was a great question. I'm actually going to meditate on that and keep asking that question seriously, because it's we need to bring it back. We need a renaissance. And thank you, Khalid. And I'm keeping my eye on everything. And I just want to say thank you real quick. Thank you for everyone watching on Facebook and YouTube. If you see me looking down, I'm looking at my phone, just trying to make sure we stay on task. Thank you for queuing up the next question. It was from a Facebook user. We kind of made it a little more succinct. In your research, did you find out more about how the church influenced slavery and their involvement during Reconstruction? Now, I don't know if they mean the Black church or the white
Right.
church.
Well, actually, that's why it's a good question, because it demands that we be specific when we answer. And I think the answer would be that the white churches in Charleston had a very different view of slavery than the Black churches in Charleston. And so we talk a little bit about, in the beginning of the book, some white ministers in town, of course, saying that slavery was good and benevolent, and this was the natural state of Africans who had been, brought against their will from Africa. But then, of course, Black churches really being sites of liberation and reading the Bible in very different ways. And this, of course, really gets at the story of Denmark Vesey himself. Right.
I mean, he's certainly his church, which becomes Emmanuel Church, called the African Church at the time, is a place where Vesey and others are sharing information, sharing knowledge, sharing a different vision of slavery, a different vision of what is going on in the world and potential to resist slavery. And as a result, when their plot to free themselves, liberate themselves, and flee the city, when white authorities find out about it, they lash out, they dismantle a manual. They destroy it and sell it off for the lumber, and effectively eventually outlaw Black churches. And that lasts until 1865. And in 1865, one of the first things that Black communities do is they start to rebuild churches. And it's Vasey's son who rebuilds the first or the second iteration of the African Church of Emmanuel in the immediate wake of the Civil War. And then during Reconstruction, the Black church, African American churches, I should say, it's not one church. They are central to cultivating a sense of community, but also political. They're very political in the 1860s and 1870s. They are the center of Republican, and Republican is not very different from our Republican today. It's the progressive side of the political spectrum. They are the center. That's where they're having meetings. That's where they're drafting petitions. That's where they're starting and ending some of these parades that are going on. And so it's central to both slavery and its aftermath, both on the white and African American side.
Yeah. Right. Your comment about the rebuilding of the church reminds me of shout out to Doug Egerton, because I know he covered that. Shout out to him for rocking the t-shirt too. Thank you all for that. But I love I got into his work around Reconstruction, and it's very, very good. I hope I pronounced his last name right. Is it Egerton or Edgerton? Is it Egerton?
That's one of those questions where we're but you never talk about your friend's last name, right?
For the longest I was calling Jeanell by her Instagram name because I forgot her last name was Marvin.
But you happen to know that Doug has a BC co-conspirator t-shirt.
That's what you said.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I sent it to him, so he was very, very excited.
You don't know how big of a moment that is. Okay, I think there's another question. We're swapping out interpreters, but here we go. Jen Hartman. Shout out, Jen. This should be required reading for all Charlestonians. Is there a consolidated Reader's Digest version of the book? Ooh, yeah.
There's
not.
But
we could take your question and use it to pressure the
right.
publisher.
So we did have a early on, after our book came out in 2018, a number of people, especially our preface, which is really a 30-page history of the rise and fall of slavery. The rest of the book is about the battle over the memory of it. But the first 30 pages in the preface, beyond our introduction, is a history of slavery in Charleston. And we did talk. I had several folks who worked at historical sites in Charleston who really said that they had photocopied that and given that section to everyone who worked there because it was the succinct Reader's Digest version, as the question just put it, version of slavery in Charleston that they wanted everyone there to at least who worked there to know, to be able to answer any question. And so we did talk a little bit with our publisher about could we put together a kind of pamphlet version of that could be sold at every bookstore. And hey, let's pitch it to the whole Charleston school district.
Right.
So we did talk about that early on, and then we pushed out a quick paperback because the book was successful and never went back to that question.
But that would have only been that early part about the history of slavery in Charleston. I like the idea. I'd be interested to know what this questioner thinks the ideal length would be for a Reader's Digest version. Seriously.
Or anyone else.
Yeah.
Wow.
What would be long enough but not too long?
Right. That'd be interesting. As a Reader's Digest fan,
Yeah.
I would really, really love that. But I just think there needs to be complimentary, just a lot of little. I don't know what books. I know how music, you get all these different types of versions of music, but I realize I just need some companion pieces or something, a syllabus or something. But I think there was one more. Yes, there's a question I really wanted to tackle before we kind of steer. From Susanna. Thank you, Susanna, for your comment. Curious to know about it. Anyone disagree with you? I was caught up in a little bit of dust up with some Southern Charm folk, some Calhoun, a little bit. I won't get into that, but it brought up a lot of folks kind of wrestling for memory, wrestling for that monopoly of public memory. And I wonder if there's any white descendants nah, this is not true.
Right.
So we gave a number, or we have given a number of talks that come out of the book in Charleston over the years, maybe 3 or 4.
Probably more.
Probably more.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the crowd that shows up to a book talk like this tends to be somewhat self-selected in that they're probably not going to be.
They're not looking to fight you.
And they're not going to be too defensive. If there are, white Charlestonians in the audience who are descended from some of these slave-owning families, they're wrestling with it, and they're, I'm sure there's a spectrum, but they're owning up to what that might mean for their lives. We had one event out at Drayton Hall where there was a descendant of someone who was very prominent in the Society for the Preservation of Spirituals.
Oh.
A grandson of a president of that organization when that organization was still really popular.
Oh, wow.
And, he was struggling with, I think, what that organization meant and the involvement of his family members, but he wasn't super defensive. He wasn't super defensive.
He brought that up and sort of, he didn't seem defensive. To be honest, the times where and it's not with people whose family members felt insulted, but that I do occasionally, I don't do it as much anymore, but certainly as we were working on this book, I would occasionally dip my foot in this Facebook group called Charleston History Before 1945. It's a very big Facebook group.
It's still around.
Still around. Oh yeah.
And sometimes we used it as a resource to get leads on
people to talk to and this and that. And it's 30,000. I don't know. A lot of people are involved, and a lot of it is people just sharing photos. Here's this Charleston photo from 1947. It's curious that they said it at 1945, like 1955, 65. Civil rights history doesn't apply.
It's not really that curious.
But yeah, not that. But anyhow, and actually, to be fair, the moderators of it are very good.
They are
good.
And I've had a lot of interactions with them, and they're all very good, as is the woman who created it. But there is inevitably over the last 5 or 6 years, like clockwork, every 2 or 3 months, there is something about Confederate monuments, Confederate flags, what caused the Civil War. And I've been stupid enough to get drawn into some of these debates. And that's where that you get a lot of defensiveness, a lot of, people just rolling out the lost cause apologies, and they don't want to have any, every sort of explanation, ahistorical rationalization about slavery, about the Civil War that comes out of the mouths of lost cause defenders in our book has been trotted out to me on that site, and usually I get frustrated and leave. But that's about we sort of expected more pushback.
We expected more. So I think that the issue is one I already mentioned, who comes to book talks, and then really relatedly, who buys the book. I think that somebody who is starting out in a defensive posture is probably not going to buy the book in the first place. And then this gets back to the question that somebody asked earlier about how do you then share this information to change minds. And I think that maybe the sad reality is that there is probably a certain set of people who just aren't ever going to be interested in reading something like this because it is going to implicate them in this larger system, and they're not ready to confront that.
Maybe when we've written op-eds in large national, like we've written a New York Times op-ed and that deals with these topics, which we have, and that's where we'll get emails that, shut up, you Californians, why are you talking to us about the South? You've never been here. And meanwhile, Blaine was born and raised in Louisiana. I lived in the Carolinas for 10 years, but they couldn't imagine that anyone could possibly have this perspective being from Charleston.
Which again is a complete erasure of Black Charlestonians.
Yes. And so, there's so many comments that came bubbling in. I just wanted to sum up because we won't be able to get to everyone. Leslie, y'all let me know if we can keep, whatever. It's a lot in the chat, but basically people say 30 pages on the whole Reader's Digest, so around 30 pages.
30 pages.
A lot of people all like 30 to 50 pages, and a lot of people are offering up you need an app, a self-guided tour / app type deal, and like McLeod. McLeod has something like that.
Right.
And also another was something that it sounded like it would amount to a syllabus, perhaps. Maybe that, I don't know. But I love your notes and you have tons of notes back here that you could essentially use to draw upon it and really inform a classroom. And I really love the back of the book. So I wanted to go ahead and let's bring this home. Again, thank you to everyone who's watching on YouTube and Facebook. But I wanted to leave this remaining time to ask both Blaine and Ethan what's next. And given what's all going on, I know you got a lot going on, but what's next for writers like you who are so interested in talking about history?
Yeah. Well, we think that we will be leaving Charleston, metaphorically speaking. I know.
Although who knows, Reader's Digest maybe.
that could be it. It's far from California. And we went back probably 15 to 20 times after we moved here in 2007. And, that's a pretty long trip. We have 2 daughters here in California. So, but we're not leaving southern port cities altogether. We think that we will be moving on to a New Orleans topic that continues our interest in race, politics. This one does not deal with memory necessarily, though I'm sure we'll touch on that some.
Right. So, I mean, what our focus is going to be to tell the story of the segregation fight in New Orleans public schools. The most famous character that individual, I should say, involved in that is Ruby Bridges. I'm sure most of the people who are watching at least know the name. She was famously memorialized in the painting, Norman Rockwell painting.
Norman Rockwell,
for a few years after that. But it's a story that actually involves several other heroic schoolgirls, Black New Orleans schoolgirls, second graders, and set in 1960. But it's wrapped around the presidential election of 1960 and Kennedy Nixon, and pretty nasty, vehement resistance by very powerful white supremacists who were part of the White Citizens Council in New Orleans and in Louisiana. It's a story that gets at race and politics and the creation of a modern Southern Republican, conservative Republican Party. So a lot of themes that persist in modern America and in the modern South.
We were really interested in these issues of kind of this party realignment that happens over the course of the 20th century, where the Democratic Party becomes the party that is interested in civil rights. And we were interested in massive resistance, white Southerners resisting at all costs the call for desegregation. And it seems like it's a story that really needs a narrative history that people might just pick up and start reading. And New Orleans from Fresno is only 2 plane flights away as opposed to Charleston, which is 3. So right. A little closer. Not super close, but a little
and close to your family.
Yeah, my family's in Louisiana, so.
But our foot remains. Our interest remains in Charleston. We still have a lot of great friends and colleagues and folks there who are working on important stuff that we are. We say we're a little bit involved in helping to work with the International African American History Museum and some of its the text for its exhibits.
I want to just interrupt. Please keep us posted on that, because I know a lot of folks would be interested in whatever hand you had or anything of interest to you both. And it's okay if you cheat on us with New Orleans, it's okay.
And I do want to put in a pitch, though. You mentioned in your notes, about the Tuvalu historical marker. I don't know if I talked to you about that.
Heck yeah, that's where I got it from.
I pitched the mayor on that back in 2017 or 2018. I can't remember. He was interested, Mayor Tecklenburg. He was interested. It didn't go anywhere. And then I sort of moved on to other things. It will. That's the call to action. Over 700 people signed up to be interested in this book club. And I'm assuming many of them are invested in, righting the wrongs of erasure historically. And the Tuvalu historical marker, it literally came from your mouths, and
that is my mission, to get that historical marker
Well,
up.
we'd love to be involved in that. I mean, it's important for so many reasons. Not, I mean, it's a peace and celebration, but I think it is important because it provides a big space for women too, right?
Yeah.
Who often
Black women.
And that's one of the reasons that I like it so much.
And it's such an important, it's such a central place for the city, but it's imagined as a white space, right? It's
Imagined as a white space. Yeah, thank you. And I thank you so much for stressing that. I think for folks who, please revisit that part about the Tululu and revisit how Black women were treated and seen and viewed. And it's really important. That's what it holds a very special place in my heart. And it's not just imagined for.
Well, let's get it done.
Yeah, we're gonna get it done. At the scroll at the bottom, because we're so fancy and professional.
Yeah.
So if you want to join the effort to erect a historical marker at Tululu, and also I want to bring a version of the Tululu to that part of White Point Garden. Please make sure you subscribe to the Charleston Activist Network newsletter, and they'll get it. But this is the bit.ly link at the bottom of the screen. Reach out to me via DM if you miss it, email, all that good stuff. I do also want to invite folks. We're going to continue this conversation. I know, again, I think at the beginning it was at least 200 people watching. It's just we couldn't get to everyone's comment and question. We wanted to center the voices of people who are from here, Black folk who are from here, and we're going to continue this conversation over in Zoom. So you can hit me up in my DMs or email, and you can follow. We can have a little after chat. But I want to say thank you so much. First and foremost, Courtney, Tony, thank you so much. Ethan, Blaine, thank you so much. You don't know how much this meant to me having you as guests at my first book club meeting. My co-moderators who inspired me, seriously, Jeanell and Khalid, thank you so much for everything you've done to help us with this space. Y'all, we're gonna keep working on this. The next book is the Charleston syllabus. So yes. And so y'all, we're gonna get this right, and we have gotten it right. And thank you so much to Leslie, who just made the production quality just amazing. This is great. And so the next one is gonna be even better. And I'm looking forward to it. So we just want to say good night in this space. Join me in Zoom for the next, for a little bit chit chat. 100 people, that's all I can fit. So thank you both. And I will correspond with you via email and text.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
It was fun.
Bye.
Bye.